Hello there, everybody. I haven't been doing this for a while. I've just kind of been watching and waiting, really, and to see how life pans out. This is my office area, and this is a talk for an education module. I'm hoping to launch the art of the screenplay. And so I thought I would start by just doing a module 1 right here, right in front of you. I'm hoping to launch a micro screenplay course, which is to teach the art of the screenplay in 3 to 4 sessions. And I'm not even sure if that's going to work, so I thought I would give it a try. I'm actually hoping to launch it on Mastermind, but I can't quite work out their interface, their directory in order to do a live session, which is part of it. So I thought I would kick it off and give it a try. Module 1 is about, guess what, the beginning of a screenplay. And, I've heard and listened to screenplay writers and producers talk about, and even film directors, about trying to not have beginning, middles, and ends in their stories, and I think that's ridiculous. You have to start a book somewhere, you have to start a story somewhere, and the film business is very, very competitive. So that film buyers, the people who buy films for cinemas, tend to only look at the first 5 minutes of a screenplay. And if you haven't grabbed them by then, and if you haven't explained your character's resolution, that the challenge that they have in life that they must solve, and explain that within the first 5 minutes, you aren't going to go anywhere. So yes, you really do need a beginning, middle, and an end. And actually, it's quite hard to tell a beginning, middle, and an end, because often for writers, they get the explanation of a character and what the character is all about mixed up with the actual narrative. But they're two very different things. The character is the being, and they will have a description that goes with them. But the story is separate from that character. And then it's the responsibility of the writer to melt those things together. So a lot of writers get into what I would call characterization, and that takes away from the story. You don't want to be describing the protagonist all the time, because if you want to grab somebody in the first 5 minutes, you're going to have action. And that's how the action movie came about, was because it was a necessity to sell the films. So if you started a film with an explosion, you had to pretty much explain how that came about. And that's how you would grab your audience. I'm not a fan of those types of films. I think that, you can create a beginning, middle, and end with either a romantic idea, and storyline, as well as other storylines, like, for example, the standard historical character who has to be told factually in what actually happens to them in their life. Although that can be a bit of a trap for a writer, because if you're doing a biopic, it can end up being quite mundane until you then figure out, the big question. What is it that your character has a challenge in their life with, and how do they resolve it? And you really must ask that question on page 1, and to begin to start to figure out how you're going to sort it out. And if you don't do that, I think the writer becomes confused, and I think you can have a rambling narrative that doesn't get to the key points and the key pages that will tell you how this challenge or this obstacle that the character is facing is going to be sorted out by the end of the film. So if you start with that idea, it then becomes very easy in your mind to set up the challenge. What is it that's happened? Are they an aspiring, gifted person who's maybe been denied that or has to go and try and figure out how to get involved in that career that they want to? It could be a story about a woman, similar idea that they need to try and get on the course and the path to a livelihood, etc. It could be a 9 to 5 story, the famous comedy with the 3 women. And so it could be that you're taking it in that direction. All of these tactics, if you like, help the writer to begin the story. And, when I think about myself as a writer, I started with a very, very, very hard premise because it was a film about a writer, Robert Burns, who was the famous national poet of Scotland. And it's very hard to write about a writer because the creation of their writing is internal in their head. And so you therefore have to try and get that out onto the paper as well. And it can be quite mundane and boring. The process of watching a person write is the writing on the paper. Well, that's not a story, is it? So I chose to try and look at the challenges that he faced in life. Although he was a very successful poet, and to this day people remember him with the famous Burns Supper and all the rest of it. But he actually died in poverty, and he didn't manage to gain the success of money in that way. So I felt that I wanted to find out about his challenge in life, which was to try and stop that process of being poor, but he never succeeded. And I wanted to look at the reasons why he had died in poverty. And it pretty much turned out that he had died in poverty because his poems were too political. They rubbed people up the wrong way. And he was challenging the establishment. And as a result, he wasn't encouraged to continue as a writer. And it pretty much made it very, very hard for him to make any money by the end of his life. But he was also stuck in what I would call the subplot, which was the French Revolution. And I made that the subplot. But you couldn't understand how he ended up in poverty unless you understood his position on the French Revolution, which of course was that he supported the poor people and the peasants, and he also did that in Britain as well. And that was the reasons and the challenge that he had. In all other things, I think he had pretty much had great success. He had success with women, and he had success with his writing, and would go to places and be able to speak to all sorts of people with large audiences. So that's pretty clear that you would have to decide what your narrative is going to be. And it is not possible to write a screenplay, I believe, without having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And today, because it's the first module, I want to talk about the beginning. Yes, so you really must take that question very seriously. What is the challenge of the character? And you would want to have set that up by page 10. And you can use all sorts of techniques. You could tell it, you could show it obviously the other big rule with the screenplay is don't say it, don't talk it, tell it. So you're showing it. So you might, for example, start it with a character, as a child, explaining what that child or what that person had to overcome by the time they're 20, and then you fast forward to the event that they have to sort out in their life. So you would start that within the first 5 minutes, and by page 10 you've figured out this is what this character needs to do. And then you advance the script from there. And I would say there's lots of techniques that are used, not just, you start with an explosion, but, it is a good tactic actually to start with the most dramatic thing that happens in that person's life and then flash back to the beginning where they themselves might be telling the narrative. That is a really good tactic. So this is very much a tester for people to hear what I feel is the situation. I've written 3 screenplays. The one about Robert Burns did very well. It became a bestseller in quite a number of parts of the world, and so you can either choose the very hard biography. I wouldn't recommend it for a first time screenwriter. I would recommend that they take a very, very simple subject matter with maybe maximum maybe 6 characters and weave the story through. They should start with something contemporary instead of this big historical, epic. You want to avoid that if you can, and try and keep it contained so that you yourself as a screenwriter learns the techniques of how to take that character from his beginning or her beginning through to the middle, and then resolving the thing that is the challenge by the end of the film. Romantic comedies obviously work very, very well because it's obvious. You would probably set up, possibly even on page 1, that the character has chosen the wrong person and they're really in love with somebody else. But that storyline goes awry, obviously, because that person is maybe in love with somebody else. And by the end of the screenplay, you, of course, want those two to be together, don't you? Otherwise, you're disappointing the audience. So yeah, there are certain ways and means to manage your own screenplay and to try and get it through the different stages. I would say by page 10, you've begun your story. You might ramble into maybe page 20 to try and explain what's going on with your character and all those elements. But I wouldn't get involved too much in characterization. You can wait to see what personality they develop. Although obviously you want to decide, is the person an introvert or an extrovert, so that you would know how to describe that person. But I think characterization can get in the way, and it's not a good tactic to get so involved in that you don't tell the story, So you do have to have your plot lines sorted out. But I wouldn't try and work out your subplot until possibly the middle of the screenplay. And sometimes you can add a subplot afterwards. What is a subplot? Well, that's probably adding the enemy and the baddie. Although sometimes you might start your screenplay with introducing the baddie instead of the protagonist, so that the audience know what it is, the challenge that the protagonist has to get through by the end of the film. So that there are ways and means to organise a screenplay. And because this is a module for a potential mastermind.com course, I would then, of course, challenge my students to attempting by next module to have started their screenplay and have written to page 10 for next week. Or maybe possibly page 20 if they feel that they could get as far as that. And then we would discuss and look at the achievement of that, because it is a great achievement actually to get to page 20 in your screenplay, because by then you have to set up all your characters and introduce them and then go forward to the next part of the story. So I would then, with my students, what I would do is, because the expectation would be that you hope by the end of the 4 modules that they would have completed or at least got to page 75 on their 90-minute screenplay, and then be able to write the rest and decide what happens to that character. So that's the challenge. So I'm going to leave it there and leave my imaginary class to actually get on with writing to page 10 for next week. And of course I would, if I had a group of people who were responding to me, I would of course have them describe the screenplay that they want to write, the idea that they want to do, and where they want to take it, how they want to introduce those characters, what's the setting, is it contemporary, is it a buddy story with guys, or is it a female story, is it where the woman is faced with a challenge and how is she going to solve it. And then of course there's multiple political thrillers, all sorts of things. But it doesn't matter what walk of life your character is in, they still, like real life, have challenges that they have to solve. Real life is a little bit different in the sense that it's only with hindsight that you might actually know what your own personal challenges are. Particularly if you're plodding along in 9 to 5 and you're not paying attention to your own personal goals, or maybe you've lost your goals. Now that would be an interesting start of a screenplay, as a character who wants to rediscover what they actually wanted to do in their lives at the very beginning, and they're maybe in their middle age and discovered that they want to go off and do that thing. That's always a very good tactic, and it does interest the audience. Although it's genre based, it might not be one that would be of interest to a younger audience, who tend to mostly be interested in challenging films that are there at the beginning of their lives, which have empathy with teenagers, teen movies, which are a particular sort of a genre. I'm not necessarily a fan of teen movies, because I think they can be very superficial and they get stuck in this kind of adolescence, which means that by the end of the movie you don't really resolve a lot for the character. That's my only complaint about teen movies. I think they could move into bigger, more panoramic conclusions for those characters, but often they don't. They get stuck in the minutiae of the issues of the setup of it only being for a certain age group. But that's interesting in itself, and it's interesting for writers to look at all those different genres and give it a bash, give it a try. But I will say, as I said at the beginning, you need a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And, you know, I certainly, every screenplay that I begin at the beginning, I learn something, and obviously you learn about those characters, you research them, and you try and add to what it is they're trying to say about the romance too. That's it. Thank you for listening, everybody. That's the end of this stream for tonight, and we'll see how it goes. Bye for now.